begin to be celebrated as a federal holiday on tomorrow, June 18th, 2021, with the passage and signing of the bill by President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, our segment today is entitled History Matters. And you might ask, why do we have a session like this? So let's talk first about why does history matter? History is to the nation as memory is to the individual. As persons deprived of memory become disoriented and lost, not knowing where they have been and where they are going, so a nation denied a conception of the past will be disabled in dealing with its present and its future. And that's actually a quotation from Dr. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. So history is important because not only does it deal with our past, but it allows us to understand where we are today and where we are going in the future. You know, history matters because of things such as critical race theory, the 1619 Project, pandemics, racial violence, voter suppression, and reparations. We need to know where we have been to know where we are now and where we need to go in the future. We're going to start this evening's session with talking about our newest federal holiday, Juneteenth. As I mentioned earlier, just today, June 17th, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris signed the bill making this our latest federal holiday. And our last federal holiday was signed into existence by President Ronald Reagan in 1983, and that was the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday holiday. Well, what is Juneteenth? The name Juneteenth is a contraction of June 19th, because on June 19th, 1865, Major General Gordon Granger of the United States Army traveled into Galveston, Texas, with a general order that he issued allowing the enslaved people of Galveston, Texas, and Texas in general to know that they were free. And I want to share with you what the general order actually says. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that of employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So this is what Major General Gordon Granger issued on June 19th, 1865. Now let's back up and look at this. Enslaved people in the state of Texas had technically been free since January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The goal of the Emancipation Proclamation was to free all enslaved people living in states that were in rebellion against the United States. So it did not affect enslaved people living in Missouri or Kentucky or Delaware or Maryland or any places that had been recaptured, such as certain areas of Louisiana, Tennessee, and South Carolina. But those areas that as of January 1st, 1863, were still in active rebellion against the United States in what we call the American Civil War, the people enslaved in those areas were to be considered free. But in Texas, it wasn't until June 19th, 1865, that enslaved individuals living there got the word that they were free. And let's look at this proclamation for a minute. You notice that General Granger begins the proclamation with the people of Texas. So he's not just informing the enslaved individuals who have been living in Texas, but he's also informing their former masters about this proclamation of freedom. And he says, in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States. Now, Abraham Lincoln had issued that proclamation in 1863, but by June 19, 1865, Abraham Lincoln had been dead almost 2 months. He was assassinated in April of 1865. And he says that this proclamation involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. This is very significant because do you understand that prior to the issuance of this General Order 3 in Texas and in most places that were slave holding, African people, formerly enslaved people, were considered the property of the people who enslaved them. They were considered the property of these people. So now he's saying that they have an absolute equality of personal rights over themselves, and rights to have property. And this involves their interactions with their former masters and themselves. And he says that they are to change their relationship from being master and slave to employer and hired labor. And while on the one hand, he's making all these very radical statements, he ends off the general order with kind of a compromise. He says that they are to remain where they are and work for wages, and that they will not be allowed to just go to military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness either on the military post or elsewhere. Now, he makes this statement because in the United States military during the Civil War, they developed a term of contraband to refer to formerly enslaved people who would gather at forts and camps of Union Army looking for freedom, looking for employment, looking for any number of things, including family members. And he's saying that this is not going to be allowed, that these formerly enslaved people are encouraged to stay where they had already been living. And let's face it, what would be the likelihood that the people who had enslaved them will say, okay, now we're going to work out a wage system with you. And when he talks about idleness, most black codes after the Civil War will include crimes of vagrancy and use those crimes as an excuse to re-enslave the formerly enslaved. You know, a few years ago, Ava DuVernay did a documentary on Netflix called The 13th, which talks about the 13th Amendment, which was passed in 1865, that formally ended slavery in the United States, except if you had been convicted of a crime. That's why the idea of idleness and vagrancy were so important in that crucial 1865 to 1870 period and beyond, because it gave them a way to utilize that loophole in the 13th Amendment to re-enslave people who had previously been enslaved. So that is General Order number 3, as issued by Major General Gordon Granger. And as I said, it was issued in Galveston, Texas. And it made sure that these people knew that they were no longer the property and unpaid workers of the people that they had been enslaved by. So, and you understand that April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee had unconditionally surrendered the Confederate forces to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. So think about this. The people in Galveston, Texas had technically been free since January 1st, 1863. They were now being told on June 19th, 1865, they were free. And technically, they had also been freed April 9th, 1865, with the unconditional surrender of the Confederate forces to Ulysses S. Grant and the United States military. But part of the reason why it was necessary for Gordon Granger to go to Texas, in Texas, slavery had continued as the state experienced no large-scale fighting or significant presence of Union troops. Many enslavers from outside the Lone Star State had moved there, as they viewed it as a safe haven for slavery. After the war came to a close in the spring of 1865, General Granger's arrival in Galveston that June signaled freedom for Texas' 250,000 enslaved people. Although emancipation didn't happen overnight for everyone, in some cases enslavers withheld the information until after the harvest season. Celebrations broke out among the newly freed Black people, and Juneteenth was born. That December, slavery America was formally abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So let's look at the stages of emancipation in the United States. Abraham Lincoln technically freed enslaved people who lived in areas of rebellion on January 1st, 1863. April 9th, 1865, with the surrender of Confederate forces to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, enslaved people everywhere were freed. On June 19th, 1865, with the issuance of General Order 3 by Major General Gordon Granger in Galveston, Texas, enslaved people were told of their freedom again. And finally, slavery was formally abolished in the United States in December of 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment. So Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery in America. It is also called Black Independence Day and Emancipation Day. How should we celebrate it? We should celebrate Juneteenth by sharing by supporting Black businesses, sharing Black people you admire, educating yourself on Black history, taking time to rest, celebrating freedom, using your voice to spread love. Now, I want to tell two stories about emancipation. One, I work at the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University, and our founder was Margaret Walker, who wrote the novel Jubilee based on the experiences of her great-grandmother and grandmother. And in the novel Jubilee, which is, as I mentioned, based on their experiences, Viry, Margaret Walker's great-grandmother, Ennis Brown, Viry's current husband, Randall Ware, Viry's first husband, and Margaret Walker's biological great-grandfather, because he was the father of her grandmother, have a conversation about what does it mean to be free. For Viry, freedom means that her children can get something she never had, an education. And she strives very hard to make sure Jim and Minna and the rest of her children have the opportunity to get an education. And her son, Jim Ware, will be one of the first graduates of Selma University after emancipation. Ennis Brown, her current husband, his idea of freedom, of emancipation, is working for himself. He has spent his life as an enslaved individual, working to enrich others. Now he is determined to work the land for himself and for his family, and to ensure economic security for his wife and his children, and for himself. And then Randall Ware, Viry's first husband, the father of her two oldest children, who would go on to serve in the Georgia state legislature after emancipation and after the passage of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which gave African American men the right to vote. He says political freedom is the freedom that Africans and formerly enslaved people, African Americans and formerly enslaved people, need the most. And I make a distinction because Randall Ware had never been a slave. He had always been a free individual. And he says, if you don't have political freedom, if you don't have political rights, people can take away your economic freedom, and they can deny you the opportunity of an education because they have the political power to do that. So he argues for the idea that people of African descent living in the United States need primarily first political freedom. And, this is a very relevant conversation for today. What do we think of as important when we hear the word freedom? What is freedom to us today? Is it in terms of education and making sure that all our children have access to a quality education? Is it economic? Is it making sure that not only are our families, but our communities economically viable? Is it political? Is it making sure that we have people in office who look like us, from the president's office down to local offices in our community? So for us today, June 17th, 2021, if someone were to ask us, what is freedom to me? What is important? What do I think of when I hear the word freedom or emancipation? What would we say today? What would you say if someone asked, what to you is freedom? And how do we protect our freedom enlarge our freedom, and utilize our freedom to our best possibility. So in terms of celebrating Juneteenth, we are doing some of the things that I just talked about. We are talking about how to educate yourself on Black history, and that's what this History Matters section is all about. And we're celebrating the idea of freedom. And we're using our voices to spread love, and I would add to spread hope throughout our city, our country, and our community. I want to share some local Juneteenth celebrations that will be going on this weekend. Juneteenth Freedom Festival, Emancipation Fest, and Rally for Peace. Ujima Jackson, in partnership with several local organizations, will host Juneteenth Freedom Festival, Emancipation Fest, and Rally for Peace on Saturday, June 19th, which is actually Juneteenth, here in Jackson. It will be located in the Farish Street Black Business District at the corner of Farish and Monument Streets. And it will be Saturday from 4 to 8 p.m. and it's free. Another local event is the Magnolia Sunset Markets, which are, of course, were created by our own Cindy Ayers Elliott, Dr. Cindy Ayers Elliott. The Magnolia Sunset Markets, alongside a dynamic group of small business owners, have teamed up to celebrate the Juneteenth 2021 holiday over 3 days in Jackson, Mississippi. Juneteenth weekend 2021 happens Friday, June 18th through Sunday, June 20th in Jackson, Mississippi, and is a collaborative project of Magnolia Sunset Markets, Fauna Food Works, Hay Healer, and the Flamingo Jackson. Juneteenth weekend is held in Jackson and also offers 3 days of special events and local attractions for attendees and visiting guests. Weekend events are individually ticketed and limited in capacity. For more information, go to www.magnoliamarkets, MagnoliaMarketsJKN.com/Juneteenth Weekend 21 for more information about tickets and prices. Also, the Judah School of Performing Arts will host Journey to Freedom at Jackson Academy Performing Arts Center on Saturday, June 19th. The recital will present a retelling of Black history through song, dance, and speech, and focus on how far the community has come. And this will be Saturday, 1 to 3 p.m., Jackson Academy Performing Arts Center, which is located at 4908 Ridgewood Road in Jackson. General admission is $25 at the door. Children 3 and under are free. Juneteenth Small Business Expo. More than 40 vendors from Jackson, Gulfport, Birmingham, Memphis, and Atlanta will be on hand at the Juneteenth Small Business Expo Saturday. Merchandise ranging from children's clothing to handmade jewelry and food will be available for purchase. Organizers also say that a local massage therapist will also be on site, along with tarot card reader, a makeup artist, and more. This event is Saturday, June 19th, 2 to 6 p.m. at the A1 Event Center, which is located at 1415 Country Club Drive, Jackson, Mississippi, and the event is free. Now, outside Jackson, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Vicksburg Juneteenth Heritage Festival Committee, a local nonprofit, will host its 2021 Juneteenth Heritage Festival on Saturday. Organizers said the event will feature live music, dozens of vendors, and food trucks. Speeches detailing the history of Juneteenth will also be a part of the festivities. Informational booths for members of the Black community who need help with finding everything from health care to adult education classes will be available as well. This will take place Saturday, June 19th, 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., Vicksburg City Park and Pavilion, 100 Army-Navy Road, Vicksburg, Mississippi, and it is free. It is a free event as well. If you know of any additional Juneteenth events, please share them with us.
Hey, Willie, good afternoon. This is Jim Caskey over at MCH. It's about 3:15. Mr. Harold told me to give you a call. You can reach me.
So that's about Juneteenth. Any comments or questions in our audience? We are also on Facebook Live. So do we have any, Willie, do we have any comments from Facebook on Facebook Live about Juneteenth or any of the things we've discussed so far? And as I said, if anyone has any additional events, please share them to our Facebook page in terms of Juneteenth events so that we can get the word out about Juneteenth. Willie?
I don't think we have any questions right now, Angela, but I want people to, they can also email those questions for you to mail, M-A-I-L, at womenforprogress.net, mail at womenforprogress.net. If you have any questions regarding the historical information that Angela shared tonight, please email us, and we'll be glad to get you connected. We also have a list of some exciting events around Juneteenth that we will share with you also. We'll get those posted up to our Facebook tonight also. So if you have any questions regarding tonight's conversation, email us at mail, M-A-I-L, at womenforprogress.net. And Ms. Stewart will email you your responses back extremely quickly. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Okay, Angela?
Yes. Now our next and final topic is critical race theory. Just as we are celebrating the passage of the federal holiday bill to make Juneteenth a holiday, something else that is going on throughout the United States and is occupying state governments throughout the United States is arguments over critical race theory. And is it something that should be taught in our schools? Is it something that should be supported with federal funds or state funds? States such as Tennessee, for example, Governor Greg Abbott signed a law limiting how educators can talk about current events in America's history of racism. What I find interesting about this, nobody's denying that America has a racist past. They just don't want anybody to talk about it. And, one African proverb says that things that remain hidden can't be healed. And I don't think people understand that when they take this tack. Notably, the law prohibits schools from ever using as a teaching tool the New York Times 1619 Project. The prize-winning endeavor theorizes that the real founding of America took place in 1776. But 1619, the year when the first, not in 1776, but in 1619, the year when the first enslaved Africans arrived in America. So in other words, in July, the United States celebrate July 4th. And we have a history in Mississippi that up until recently, there were a large number of Mississippians who didn't celebrate July 4th because Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, fell to Union forces on July 4th, 1863. And so those dates were seen not as things to be celebrated, but to be mourned. So now they have an argument against people who want to say that the United States wasn't founded in 1776 when a group of individuals, including Benjamin Franklin and others, signed the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But it was actually founded when the first Africans were brought to this country in 1619. Critical race theory is an academic concept that is more than 40 years old. So even though we're having a lot of arguments about critical race theory now, it's become one of those big arguments that people have, particularly on the far right, and something they are adamantly against. Critical race theory has been around for over 40 years. The core idea of critical race theory is that racism is a social construct, and it's not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but something embedded in the legal systems and policies. Now, let's think about that. What does that mean? Racism, people say, well, racism is just not liking someone because of their race. No, that's not what racism is. Racism is to be able to put policies in place that hinder the progress of individuals based on their race. The basic tenets of critical race theory emerged out of a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 80s, created by legal scholars such as Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, among others. What people were looking at is phenomenon such as redlining, which says that lenders do not lend, or they lend at extremely high interest rates to areas that they consider high risk. And they used to denote these areas with a red line, so they called it redlining. And what the critical race theorists looked at is that this wasn't just a business policy, this was also a policy that was influenced by the race of the individuals who lived in these areas. Critical race theory also has ties to other intellectual currents, including the work of sociologists, literary theorists who study links between political power, social organization, and language. And its ideas have since informed other fields like the humanities, the social sciences, and teacher education. This academic understanding of critical race theory differs from representation in popular books, and especially from its portrayal by critics, often though not exclusively conservative Republicans. Critics charge that the theory leads to negative dynamics such as focus on a group identity over universal shared traits, divides people into oppressed and oppressor groups, and urges intolerance. Something I heard as a criticism of having a civil rights museum, such as the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, is that it would make white people ashamed of being white. It would make them feel bad simply because of the color of their skin. But what museums like the Civil Rights Museums do is they point out the truth of what happened in Mississippi and other places during these times of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement. Now, there are actions that people should be ashamed of, but that doesn't mean you have to be ashamed of being who you are. But you can be ashamed of what people who look like you did to other people. To an extent, the term critical race theory is now cited as the basis of all diversity and inclusion efforts, regardless of how much it's actually informed those programs. That's one thing people are saying, it's everywhere. It's informing everything that happens in terms of employment and education, and that's not necessarily true. Just because institutions offer implicit bias training, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people who work at jobs that require you to do implicit bias training. And it, to me, is informative not just for one group of people, but for all people to look at and say, are there some things that I reflectively feel about people just about looking at them, and is this the right way to feel or to handle things? And it can help inform better decisions, even in terms of hiring, in terms of how you deal with people. And I'm talking right now about implicit bias training. One conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, recently attributed a whole host of issues to critical race theory, including the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest, LGBTQ clubs and schools, diversity training in federal agencies and organizations, California's recent ethnic studies model curriculum, the free speech debate on college campuses, and alternatives to exclusionary discipline, such as the Promise Program in Broward County, Florida, that some parents blame for the Parkland school shootings. Then they argue that when followed to its logical conclusion, critical race theory is destructive and resists the fundamental ideas on which our constitutional republic is based. And this is what the Heritage Foundation claims. Now, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank that has a lot of influence, particularly on who gets nominated and appointed to the United States Supreme Court, particularly during Republican administrations. I'm pretty sure we all heard about their involvement in the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett and the other new United States, Brett Kavanaugh, as United States Supreme Court justices. Fundamentally, though, the disagreement springs from different conceptions of racism. Critical race theory puts an emphasis on outcomes. That means that racism can be measured by what happens. If I heard a story of a person talked about they were looking for a home, and when they reached out by email, the realtor was very enthusiastic and said, "Oh yeah, please come tour the house. Feel free to have an inspector come." And when she showed up and the realtor saw that she was African American, they said, "Oh, the house is off the market." So what critical race theory argues is that racism is racism when something happens. It's not just a feeling that I don't like these people, I don't want to deal with these people. As long as the only place you're acting on those kind of attitudes is on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, they're arguing that's not racism, but when your attitudes affect whether people can buy a home, whether they can get a job, these are things that are racism according to critical race theory. Here, among lawyers, teachers, policymakers, and the general public, there are many disagreements about how precisely to do those things and to what extent race should be explicitly appealed to or referred to in the process. Here's a helpful illustration to keep in mind in understanding this complex idea. In a 2007 United States Supreme Court school assignment case on whether race could be a factor in maintaining diversity in K through 12 schools, Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion famously concluded the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But during oral arguments, then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, it's very hard for me to see how you can have a racial objective, but a non-racial means to get there. Scholars who study critical race theory in education look at how policies and practices in K through 12 education contribute to the persistent racial inequalities in education and advocate for ways to change them. Among the topics they've studied, racially segregated school, the underfunding of majority Black and Latino school districts, disproportionate discipline of Black students, barriers to gifted programs, and selective admission high schools and curricula that reinforce racist ideas. So what critical race theory wants to look at and what's significant is how does race impact education and the types of education students, and let's bring it local. Let's focus on local. Jackson Public Schools. How does race impact the level and quality of education that African American students are receiving in Jackson Public Schools? Now, some might argue, well, this shouldn't affect at all, considering the superintendent of Jackson Public Schools is Black. The majority of the administrators for Jackson Public Schools are African American, and probably most of the administrators and teachers at the bulk of Jackson Public Schools are African American. But oftentimes people have different perceptions of achievement levels for students. I heard a woman who was brought in to help students prepare to do better on the American College Test, what we call the ACT. And she told a group of African American students, if you can achieve a 21 on the ACT, you'll be doing well. What you have to understand about that statement is there is no school in the state of Mississippi in terms of institution of higher learning where you can get a full scholarship with a 21 on the ACT. Most schools, Jackson State, Alcorn included, insist that you have over a 24 or above on the ACT in order to receive a full scholarship. So if you're telling students that so long as they can strive to hopefully maybe receive a 21 on the ACT, that they'll be doing good, you actually are hindering their ability to get an education that they don't have to pay for. And if they have to pay for education, oftentimes students are going to be less likely to get one. Also, what doesn't get discussed a lot of times is that there should be a correlation between ACT scores and grades. So if you have a school system where you have children who make A's and B's, but struggle to get over 20 on the ACT, there is something wrong in the curriculum and the instruction. What some people might remember, because 4 years ago, 5 years ago almost, it's beginning to seem like a long time ago, then Senator Al Franken of Minnesota and Secretary of Education nominee Betsy DeVos had a discussion over the difference between growth and proficiency in education. Schools that stress proficiency stress grades and completing successfully objectives. Schools that stress growth encourage students to try beyond what they're capable of. Let me give you an example. Children in high school, all they have to take is probably, at least when I was in high school, you're only required to take chemistry and algebra 2 if you were a college preparatory student. But schools have the opportunity. My niece, for example, took AB calculus in physics and things like, and AP courses, which broadened her horizon and actually made it possible for her to do better on things such as the ACT, which allowed her to get more money for school and just basically broaden her horizons. But if we tell students that, okay, don't worry about taking anything beyond chemistry and maybe algebra 2, and we'll work with you so you have a schedule where you can work at McDonald's in the afternoon. So once you finish the bulk of your coursework, so instead of being introduced to courses that expand your horizons and allow you to learn more that will allow you to do better on standardized testing and other things, we encourage them to do the minimum. And that's a proficiency route, as long as you, and even, if a teacher is teaching in a way that rewards completion rather than comprehension, in other words, so long as you turn in the work, whatever it is, however you do it, you get a good grade. But if somebody asks you, well, what did that mean? And you can't explain what it meant, that's the difference between completion and comprehension. And oftentimes what critical race theory and other people find is that students in African American schools are pushed toward programs that highlight and focus on proficiency opposed to growth. And that's even high performing students. My niece took, as I mentioned, physics, and she was the only African American in her class at Murrah High School right here in Jackson. And an African American young girl about her age, a little younger than her, said to me, "Your niece must be smart." And I said, why do you say that? Because she was the only Black person in that class. Now that is a child whose perception of when she looks at a class and it's only one to a very minimum number of African American students in that class, then that must be a difficult and high performing class. But if she sees a class that's all African American, she doesn't have that immediate perception about that class. And so critical race theory looks at how do these attitudes impact children. But what concerns teachers with the backlash against critical race theory is how can they talk about things such as the Trail of Tears or the Civil War or the Civil Rights Movement if everybody is opposed to critical race theory and talking about the problems in American society and civilization, honestly and truthfully. So as we celebrate Juneteenth, we have to remember why Juneteenth was necessary. Because African Americans living in Texas, who had technically been free since January 1st, 1863, didn't find out they were free until June 19th, 1865. Willie, do we have any comments? I know it's time for us to close out.
Yes, it is time for us to close out, but I want to thank all of those who gave comments. They all were so excited about the information you shared tonight. And Angela, the context in which you presented the information tonight was just awesome. It was truly a historical lesson for us and a very informative one. A lot of times when we think about these historic events, we think about them in the past. But you connected the dots for us to where we are right now and where we can be in the future. And so I just thank you for such an illuminating conversation tonight.
Thank you.
And I can tell by the comments that we got from everybody that it was definitely a timely conversation.
Yeah. And think about this when you think about what Ashton and Theodore are getting in terms of education. What are they being taught? What are they being encouraged to do in terms of beyond middle school and high school? Because a lot of that is important. And sometimes people may not even necessarily mean it in a evil way. It's just, here again, the way their brains have been formed is to immediately assume that, African American children, it used to be African American children were herded into general education courses and mechanical courses. And not that there's anything wrong with that. We need mechanics and air conditioner repair people and electricians and all of these. But the idea that when a counselor or a teacher sees a Black child, that's what they immediately assume they should be interested in, that they should be interested in bricklaying instead of being a mechanical engineer. And in order to appropriately advocate for our children, we have to recognize and talk to them and see what they are getting in terms of their curriculum. And as I said, we look back to move forward, and we know that in the past, prior to 1970, a lot of kids went to schools with teachers who said, I know you can do it, and I'm not taking any less than your best. Now, a lot of kids go to schools where, I've heard assistant principals say, so long as you keep them in the classroom, I don't care what you do with them. Mm. So we have to be conscious of those kinds of situations that children are in.
Well, Angela, we're going to wrap up with that, but I do want to highlight one more thing that you mentioned during your program is, what does freedom mean to you? And we need to ask ourselves that. We need, and that probably has evolved for many of us over the years now that we are adults. And also our children. Ask them, what does freedom mean to them? And I think that's good for us to know too, in how our children think about that.
And there are discussions out there, whether it's as simple as I ought to be able to wear my satin bonnet and pajamas anywhere I want to go, to I should be able to go to school anywhere I want to go. So kids are already having that discussion on what freedom means to them. So we need to be listening to what they're saying too.
Great. Well, this programming, History Matters, is now a monthly podcast. And Angela, is it the third Thursday of each month?
Third Thursday of the month.
Okay, third
and
Thursday of the month.
Talk about history and related to what's going on today. So today we talked about Juneteenth and critical race theory, and it just worked out perfectly because the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, president and vice president, signed the bill making Juneteenth a federal holiday today.
Right.
And our first celebration of it as a federal holiday will be tomorrow.
And I want to remind our audience that they can go back if they missed this programming. It's available on our Facebook page. You go to our Women for Progress at Women for Progress MS Facebook page. Go to videos, and there you will see this recording, the entire program for tonight. You can go back and listen to it, like I will be, because I stepped out and missed a couple of pieces, so I'm going to listen back to it. If you would like to share it with your friends, you just hit the share, open up the video, hit the share button at the bottom, and you can send it to your friends and family by messenger, and I think it'll allow you to do it by text and maybe some other options. So I want you to make sure that you share that with as many people as you can. There's nothing like good information that empowers us. Also, it's available. This program has been recorded to all of our podcast radio programming. So anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spreaker Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, all of those places you can get our program. Just go and download one of those apps, and then just search for Women for Progress Radio, and our previously archived programming is there also. I want to say, you Alexis users, I tell you, I'm just tickled to death every morning when I want to go back and listen to a programming from Women for Progress Radio. I just tell Alexa, play Women for Progress Radio, and she pops up me a recording that I can listen to. So you're available there also. And final thing is, every time Women for Progress Radio goes live, we are also live on the radio page at womenforprogressradio.com, womenforprogressradio.com. I have a lot of people say that I don't want to do Facebook. Don't want to go to Facebook. Then now, for some time now, you can, every time we go live with any of our programming, you can go to that page, womenforprogressradio.com, and it's live and in color right there on the full screen, and you can listen to it there. Thank you so much to everybody again for tuning in tonight.
Thank you, Willie, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Angela, and we're so excited about this program, and we have gotten so much wonderful feedback. And I remind everybody, this is third Thursdays at 5:30. Third Thursdays of every month at 5:30, you can tune in to History Matters and get informed, inspired, and educated. Thank you, Angela, and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right.